Vandana Shiva is not only a powerful critic and an unstoppable activist in opposition to a corrupt system that is unjust and destructive, she is a visionary, always fighting as much for the vision of what we're for as what we're against. Instead of globalization, localization. Instead of absentee owners, local economies. Instead of industrial agriculture, traditional agriculture. Local food, not imported food. Instead of dependency on imports and export markets, working for self-sufficiency. Instead of government, community. We're so grateful for her voice, her energy, and her commitment, and for her willingness to travel around the world and come to see us tonight. We're so glad she's here, and with that, here she is.
Thank you to Jerry. It's been wonderful being part of the IFG team that you created, Jerry. And thank you, Claire. Thank you, Debbie and Dolly and Victor and everyone from IFG who's here. I was starting to miss IFG over this weekend because so much of my journey on the global scene in this last decade and a half has been with the family that is IFG. I was also starting to miss IFG because IFG has been a very important organization, very important network in naming the phenomena of our times. It used to be called free trade, and to say free trade is not free took a very convoluted sentence. To just call it globalization, the conversation was easier, but that was Jerry's brilliance. And when those of us who were working on defending local economies, with it the freedoms, were starting to talk about localization, and I remember Tim Lang and Colin Hines' book on the Localization Manifesto. People didn't think we could get there. But every movement now, including Slow Food, of which I'm a vice president, which when it started out thought globalization was a wonderful idea, now has good, clean, and fair as its slogan. Localization as the way of acting, living, and thinking was put in our imagination and on the map by the network of activists who came together in IFG. Now, today I really want to dedicate myself to remembering and not forgetting. There's a wonderful statement by Milan Kundera that the struggle of people against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. I think very often we are weaker because we do not remember. We do not remember how we got into a particular mess. We do not remember who provided the insights to lead us in the past. And since President Bush is speaking right now, he doesn't remember. Because he recently said as the food prices started to rise, that was all because of us Indians. India has gone rich, Indians are eating more and better, and that's why there's a scarcity. Every part of that statement was wrong. The Indians weren't getting rich, a dispossessed peasant isn't richer. Indians were definitely not eating more. The per capita consumption has dropped from 170 kilograms per capita to 150 kilograms per capita. And definitely not eating better because, frankly, the US industrial food model is the worst that can be eaten. But even on the mathematics, 12% growth in the use of cereals in the US, not for feeding people, not even for feeding imprisoned animals anymore, which was the big chunk of grain use. 75% of the price rise has been because of that 12% increase in cereal use for turning it into ethanol and diesel for running cars. And just as everything else in this economic system works, the so-called free market and let the market rule is always based on crutches of subsidies and regulation. There's nothing like a market. The market is the favors given to giant agribusiness. The market is the regulations created to prevent honest, hard-working farmers in India from making a living, or an honest, hard-working worker in this country from making a living. That's the so-called market. And it was globalized before. That's another part of remembering. This globalization is in a way a repeat phenomenon. And agriculture's globalization has a history. It's a history which is very deeply connected to this land, to its first colonization, taking away of the lands of the Native Americans, saying it was being improved. And if you go back to the literature of that time, the American Indians don't use their land because they don't improve it. And improve it means to mess it up. That's improvement. And of course, the very word Indian is another forgetting, isn't it? That Christopher Columbus made a mistake. He thought he'd landed in my country for spices. That's what they used to sail out for in those times. But then came the cotton fields, and then came the sugarcane plantations and the indigo plantations in India, and all of it rested then on slavery, as the globalized economy of today rests in new, more subtle forms of slavery. Well, I remember one of the first movements Gandhi led in India through satyagraha, through civil disobedience, as a result of being told by our national movement that there was the slavery around indigo cultivation. He went to this region in Bihar where the floods are taking place right now, in a place called Champaran, and just articulated what the peasants were saying. We'd rather die than grow indigo. And he said, we will not grow indigo. The peasants weren't allowed to grow food for themselves. They had to grow indigo. That's the root of famine. That's the root of starvation. And that's exactly what's happening as third world countries are told to grow flowers for the Amsterdam markets, shrimps, so that you can have shrimp every day. Who needs shrimp every day? Yeah? And I think good things should stay expensive. Yeah? Shrimp should stay a luxury. The indigo cultivation was stopped. But soon the chemical age took over. And part of what chemistry gave us, then not for agriculture, but for war, were today's pesticides, later the herbicides. Even the nitrogen fertilizers came out of the explosives industry. Let me take you just back. Remember one more event. Remember the Oklahoma bombing? It was a fertilizer bomb. And it was dispossessed farmers of this country who used it for its original purpose. I'm trained as a physicist. Quanta is what I used to dream, sleep, vision, that I had psi function all over my brain. And then in 1984, a series of things happened which woke me up to the kind of agriculture we were practicing. In the summer of that year, the Golden Temple was invaded because Punjab had erupted into violence. That same summer, there was a drought in a particular part of India, and I have this tendency to, I need explanations. And I need good, honest explanations. Otherwise, I don't feel satisfied. So I looked at the data. I said, drought, why is there such an emergency? Why are cattle dying? Why are people migrating? Why is there food relief camps, the data on the rainfall was not a drought. It was 1,200 millimeters of rain. So I rushed to this area. I said, something's happened. The rain hasn't changed, but there's a drought. And it was an old farmer who educated me and said, we used to have the tall sorghum. And the sorghum gave fodder for our cattle. It gave mulching for our soils. The rain would come, it would be held in the soil. Then they gave us the short sorghum. And the short sorghum, they call it the dwarf varieties of the Green Revolution. Nothing goes back to the soil. The rain still comes as it did, but now you have desertification. Now you have drought. By December that year, we had the worst industrial disaster, the Bhopal disaster. And at the end of that year, 1984, I was asking myself questions about how did this all begin? Where did it start? And that's when I did the research and wrote the book, The Violence of the Green Revolution, where it became very clear that what we were seeing as violence, which in the media was being reported as religious violence, which it was not, was actually conflicts emerging from soils that had died, rivers that had been rerouted for intensive irrigation, seeds that were now requiring chemicals, prices that were not fixed by the farmers. And the farmers of that time in Punjab said, this is slavery. That movement called Khalistan was about agricultural slavery, but it was given a religious tag, and nobody looked below. And every conflict of our times is around vital access to the vital resources of the planet. But the conflicts are always presented as ethnic, religious, and regional. But because I'd done this book on the Green Revolution, suddenly I started to get invited to meetings on agriculture. And I'd kind of just done this to solve my own puzzles. But I'm grateful I went to one of these meetings in 1987. It was in Geneva. It was called Laws of Life. And that's where the biotechnology industry was laying out its plan for the future. The industry talked about how by the turn of the century, there would be only 5 companies controlling health and food. They talked about the tools they would have to win this race, because in their own minds, even though they were giants, they were not big enough. Ciba-Geigy wasn't big enough, Sandoz wasn't big enough, Astra wasn't big enough, Zeneca wasn't big enough. They had to all merge, and they are today Syngenta. Monsanto has bought up every seed company around the world, controls 95% of all the genetically engineered seed planted anywhere, controls, I would say, about 50 to 60% of the non-genetically engineered seed also now, because they're in a race for buying up smaller seed companies. And the instruments they laid out was, we have to do genetic engineering because the farmers can't do it. That's how we bring something new. And we have to do genetic engineering because genetic engineering allows us to claim that we have created something new, can therefore own it as our invention, and therefore have the patents. The real goal was patents. And the platform for all this was going to be the GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. They woke me up to something called the GATT. Now, this was, all the negotiations at that time were secret. We didn't really know what was going on, but I did know from the corporations or from the horse's own mouth that they had an agenda. In 91, the text of GATT was leaked out by a fellow Indian in Geneva reporting on the UN. And at that point, the person who used to head the GATT was named Arthur Dunkel. And Arthur Dunkel put out this text. You know, these secretary generals of, director generals of WTO and GATT have this habit of saying, here is a take it or leave it text. You know, take it as it is, or nothing will move. And he did that, and it was called, interestingly, the Dunkel draft text. abbreviates into DDT. I read through it, found the agreement called Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights. Found out then that TR came because it wasn't trade-related. It was about owning life on Earth. It was about forcing governments to have life patterns. And there was another agreement, the Agriculture Agreement. Later, it came out that Monsanto had a very big role in drafting this agreement called TRIPS. And they went on record to say we were the patient, the diagnostician, and the physician all in one. We defined a problem. The problem was that farmers save seeds. We offered a solution, and the solution was criminalize farmers saving seeds. And we created the courts where these trials would happen about countries not obeying this law. It would be the WTO dispute settlement. Cargill, of course, was directly involved in writing the agreement on agriculture. And again, I think it has been one of our successes that the agriculture agreement, which has only absolutely abstract language like market access and export competition and domestic support, not a word of soil, not a word on farmers, not a word on food. We have succeeded with huge contributions by the IFG to now have the negotiations talk about farmers' livelihoods, our food. The language that was supposed to be expelled has made its way back to those corridors of power. You know, when I sat through these meetings, I had a chill down my spine. So what kind of a world will it be if every seed is patented? Farmers have no option to GM. 5 companies control all our food and all our health, because many people don't realize the pharmaceutical industry is the same as the agrochemical industry, is the same as the biotechnology industry. There's no separation, they're one. So while going back to India, I was involved at that time with the forest movement, CHIPCO, the anti-dam movement, the Bhopal movement. I went back and handed over everything to those other movements, said, I'm only going to save seeds. Part of it was, I thought about Gandhi and our freedom movement, and I realized that when Gandhi had to deal with this textile monopoly, when no one could wear clothing on this planet except what had been spun in the mills of England, though the cotton could have grown in India or in the southern states of this country, but you had to buy the finished clothing from Manchester and Lancashire, Gandhi had pulled out an ancient spinning wheel. And when people had said to him and laughed, he was ridiculed and said, what do you think, these little pieces of wood? Can you get freedom with this? And he had said, it's precisely because it is so humble and so small that it's powerful. Because in the hands of every Indian, it is more powerful than any gun. So I just thought today's spinning wheel with life sciences corporations, they call themselves. Defending the freedom of life in its essence, the seed, had to be the issue. So I started to save seeds. I couldn't get a name for the movement. Genetic resources, it's still part of that reductionist genetics paradigm. I continued to save seeds till I went to this farm. In South India, it was a tribal, in a forest, deep forest, growing 9 crops. And I said, wow, you're growing 9 crops together. Because I've had this love for diversity and polycultures anyway. And I've had a huge allergy to monocultures, especially since I worked on forestry and the Green Revolution. And after I'd done this count, and I just say, oh, you've got 9 crops, he turns around and says, yeah, Navdanya. So I said, you're sounding like it has meaning more than just planting 9 crops. And he gave me this discourse on cosmology, on how the 9 crops were protecting the 9 planets and were protecting our body's health, that nothing was separated. And of course, After that, I had to name seed saving as Navdanya, which means the 9 seeds, but it can also mean the new gift. That's what we've been doing since 1987, besides joining up with IFG, being in Seattle, being in Cancun. And we've won many victories. We've prevented the patenting of neem and basmati and wheat, and I'm now going to launch a huge campaign on these companies patenting climate resilience in crops. 550 patents are out. And since in Navdanya we do the conservation through creating seed banks, we are now building up the movement on the base of the people who've saved climate resilient seeds. The 18-foot tall rice variety that survives the floods in Bihar. 18-foot tall. Or the varieties that can survive a cyclone on the coast because they're salt tolerant. We managed to prevent laws in India that would make it illegal for farmers to save seeds. And when in 1991 this DDT document had come in my hands, the first thing I did was go to every state and find out the farmers' organization of that state. I translated these treaties. I sat under trees with them and explained what was coming. And then in 1993, we had this huge demonstration to tell the government they shouldn't sign. At that point, the government kept saying, no, you're mistaken. We are going to prosper out of this. That same government now negotiates to block the increase of globalization in agriculture. It was our government which... But this remembering is about more than just which treaties, which clauses, which laws we were able to transform. I think part of it is, to me, it's always been an issue of the imagination. Because unless we can think certain things, unless in our minds we have that freedom, we can't bring it to reality. Now, I want to just give you 2 examples of the mindset that is allowing all this. I think it must have been 1992. You used to have a trade representative called Carla Hills. And she had come to India and said, using a crowbar, we're going to open up India's economy to American corporations. And I had told this to my friends, the farmers of Karnataka. And then the sunflower seed of Kargil totally failed, so the farmers literally took crowbars and tore down the entire factory and said, you can take all this back with you. If you want to use crowbars to open up the economy, we will also use crowbars to send your corporations back. But that's not the real story. The real story is then the Kargil head flies in from Australia for the Asia-Pacific region and said, these farmers are so stupid, they don't realize we have created technologies that are so smart, they prevent the bees from usurping the pollen. Yeah? And then during the biodiversity negotiations, when we were trying to prevent genetic engineered crops from being unleashed in the world and put together the biosafety protocol, I remember a particular time when I was debating Monsanto representatives, they said, the Roundup-resistant seeds, the Roundup-resistant seeds are the ones genetically engineered to tolerate higher doses of Roundup. The Roundup-resistant seeds prevent the weeds from usurping the pollen. That was the hybrids. Prevent the weeds from stealing the sunshine. Stealing the sunshine. I mean, can you imagine the mind in which a bee is a thief, biodiversity is a thief, a peasant saving seed is a thief? What a scared mind that must be. Yeah? A mind which must terminate the seed in order for fertility to stop. To be afraid of fertility, for me, that's the root of our ecofeminist resilience. But it's recognizing that it's the bees that are disappearing that is at the source of our food security. It's the sun that shines on us that is the basis of everything on this planet. The plants that convert that energy into the living carbon that we use. And I think what is at stake for us now is to create an imagination of abundance while we live peacefully with nature and while we share the gifts of nature with generosity with each other. Because we will either have scarcity and conflict and violence and war, or we will have peace and abundance. Now, in this process of having given up physics, I've spent a lot of time building up farms, doing ecological farming, a school. Fritz was generous enough to come and spend some time with us last February. And I realized two things, that the two blocks that are now stopping us from solving the food crisis are first and foremost the illusion that industrial agriculture produces more food. And for those of you who have built up farmers' markets and are practicing organic farming in this part of the world, every time they tell you that it's a luxury you're practicing, just remember, for those farmers who are committing suicide, the alternative that works is the seed on their own farm, the organic farming. We built up a Seeds of Hope movement to reverse the farmers' suicides, and it's working. The second illusion is the illusion that somehow if you ship a lot of grain around, suddenly there's more of it. It's true. Even now, after the Doha derailment, Pascal Lamy, who is now the Director General, said, "Oh my God, this is terrible. There's going to be $139 billion lost because we are not trading." He doesn't talk about probably the $500 billion saved because farmers are not getting locked into buying more pesticides, more costly seeds, because their prices of farm produce is not being driven further down because of these monopolies. The reality of the current food crisis is very simple. It's that globalization allowed Cargill, ADM, Conagra to take control of the world's food supply and then speculate on prices. Part of it, of course, is the whole biofuel issue, in which they are also big players because they are the ones who collect the subsidies. And the roots of hunger, the roots of the food crisis, the roots of climate change are actually the same roots. Just as much as the roots of violence against women, the roots of the violence against the earth, the roots of violence against every other are the same. One of the issues we've raised in the last year, which we realized has been totally missing in the discussion on climate change, is that industrial agriculture and globalized agriculture accounts for something between 30 to 40% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And you can get rid of that tomorrow. You know, when they're bargaining in Kyoto negotiations, they talk about 5% reduction, 2% reduction. Even that, they cringe and don't even do that much. You know, then they go and trade in carbon and keep the pollution at the same level and make me $1 trillion out of it. It's quite magical, the global economy, because things get created out of nothing. And talking about things getting created out of nothing, I want to give you an example. A few years ago, we are always forced to either import or export. Now we've been forced to import wheat, but then we were forced to export wheat. And India sold the wheat to Cargill and Continental. At that time, Cargill and Continental were two separate companies. Since then, Cargill has bought up Continental. We sold $60 a ton. Immediately in the international market, Cargill Continental sold it at $240 a ton. Of course, come December, we harvest in April, We had a scarcity, the prices doubled, and we had to re-import the 2 million tons. Cargill made lots of money. That's the mysterious 200 billion that Pascal Lamy is talking about. Farmers lost out, the poor lost out, India lost out on foreign exchange expenditure. The wheat was the same. 2 million we had grown and sent out, and the 2 million that was brought back. The growth in terms of trade and profits is not growth in terms of the food to feed people. In the last year of doubling of food prices, there's been a doubling of profits, Cargill and Monsanto. Monsanto has increased by $100 a bag the price of corn. Throughout history, we have known that monopolies mean hunger. Monopolies mean famine. We witnessed it during the Bengal famine. This is not about too little food growing on the land. It's not about farmers not having the capacity to grow food. And it's not about the capacity of our seeds and our crops and our biodiversity to give us enough. A lot of research I do, our native seeds, biodiversity, growing crops together, we have 10 times higher output than the most intensive chemical monoculture can ever give. And that is the way forward. Biodiverse systems, localized systems, and localized systems not just because it's an issue of trade. The pattern of production determines the pattern of distribution. What you grow, how you grow it, decides where it will go. If you grow diversity, most of it will be eaten locally. There's no way you can sell all of it. But if you grow diversity, not a single farmer goes into distress, both because they have ecological insurance, and even more, they have economic resilience. And we will need more of this with climate change. We will need more of this with speculation, because the financial volatile markets, as well as climate chaos, are posing one challenge to us. And that challenge is diversify and decentralize. And of course, at the root of it, it means also reclaiming our own meanings of what we mean when we say seed. When we say seed, have we internalized Monsanto's intellectual property? Or are we going to see it as life in permanent renewal, life in diverse expression, the embodiment of biological and cultural diversity? When we say food, will we mean anti-food? High fructose corn syrup, GMOs, they're a salt in our body. They're not supposed to go into our bodies. I call it anti-food because it's everything that food shouldn't be. Or will we recognize in food the ray of sunshine that transformed it, the gifts of the earth firm that are in it, or the mycorrhiza, or the millions of soil organisms we haven't even got introduced to. The soil life is the least known life, because just as modern science was emerging to identify everything, that's when soil was being turned into an empty container of toxic chemicals. So you don't have to know the empty container. You can just douse it with urea and DAP. To see food that is outside us as the cells that will become us, the blood that will become us. We're in a church, and there used to be a prayer, you remember? Give us this day our daily bread. Well, I definitely don't want to be a prayer to Monsanto and Cargill.